I am 26 years old. For the last 3 weeks, my life had shrunk to the size of a hospital waiting room. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and stale coffee, a scent I now associated with a constant, grinding anxiety. My mother, Eleanor, was in a coma. The doctors called it a fall. She had been found at the bottom of the stairs in our family home, a place that was supposed to be her sanctuary. My dad, David, found her. He had been a ghost ever since, haunting the hospital corridors, his face a mask of grief and exhaustion. He was 55, but in those 3 weeks, he seemed to have aged a decade. His shoulders were permanently slumped, and his eyes, which were usually so full of light and laughter, were now hollow and dim. We sat in her room, a sterile white box filled with the rhythmic beeping and whirring of machines that were keeping her tethered to the world. I held her hand, its warmth a faint but reassuring sign of the life still within her. My dad sat on the other side of the bed, his gaze fixed on her face as if he could will her to wake up through sheer force of hope. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic. Her vitals were stable. There was brain activity. It was just a matter of time, they said. But time had started to feel like an enemy, stretching each moment into an eternity of waiting. I was rereading a chapter of a book I couldn't remember starting when the doctor came in. A quiet man with kind eyes named Dr. Evans. He did his usual checks, shining a small light into her pupils, checking the monitors. My dad and I held our breath. A ritual we performed every time a medical professional entered the room. Usually it ended with a polite nod and a quiet exit. But not this time. "Eleanor," Dr. Evans said softly, his voice gentle but firm. "Can you hear me, Eleanor?" There was a flicker, an almost imperceptible flutter of her eyelids. My dad shot up from his chair, his hand flying to his mouth. I leaned closer, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Mom, it's Chloe. We're here." Her eyelids fluttered again, then slowly, agonizingly, they opened. Her eyes were hazy, unfocused. She stared at the ceiling, a faint, confused line forming between her brows. My dad let out a choked sob of relief, grabbing her other hand. "Ellie," he breathed, his voice thick with tears. "Oh, thank God you're back. You're back with us." She turned her head slowly, her movements sluggish. Her gaze drifted around the room, over the machines, over me, and then to my dad. There was no recognition in her eyes, only a deep, unsettling confusion. She tried to speak, her lips parting, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. I quickly poured a small cup of water and held the straw to her lips. She took a tiny, difficult sip. She tried again. Her voice was a fragile whisper, but the words were sharp, each one a shard of ice in the warm, hopeful air of the room. "My husband," she said, her voice raspy and weak. "My husband tried to kill me." The world stopped. The beeping of the machines seemed to fade into a distant hum. I stared at her, my mind struggling to process what she had just said. My husband. She was looking right at my dad. My dad, who adored her. My dad who built his entire world around her. He froze, his face draining of all color. The tears of joy on his cheeks now looked like tracks of profound sorrow. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked utterly destroyed, as if her words had physically struck him. "Mom, what are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Dad is right here. He would never hurt you." Her eyes, which had been distant, suddenly sharpened. They locked onto my father. The confusion on her face morphed into something else entirely. It was a look of pure, unadulterated terror. Her body went rigid. Her breath hitched. A trembling finger rose from the blanket and pointed directly at my dad's chest. And then she screamed. It wasn't a small cry of pain. It was a raw, primal scream that clawed its way out of her throat, filled with a horror so profound it seemed to shake the very walls of the room. She started thrashing, trying to pull away from him, her eyes wide with a terror that I had never seen before. Nurses burst into the room, their faces a mixture of alarm and professional calm. "What happened?" one of them asked, immediately moving to my mother's side. "I don't know," I stammered, my own panic rising. "She just woke up and she said that." My mom continued to scream, her voice growing hoarse. "Get him away from me," she shrieked, her eyes still locked on my father. "Don't let him touch me, he'll kill me." A nurse gently but firmly guided my dad toward the door. "Sir, I think it's best if you step outside for a moment," she said. "Let us handle this." My dad looked like a man in a trance. He stumbled backward, his eyes never leaving my mother's terrified face. The accusation, the sheer venom in her voice, had shattered him. He backed out of the room without a word, his expression one of complete and utter devastation. As soon as he was out of her line of sight, another nurse administered something into my mom's IV line. Slowly, the thrashing subsided. The screams quieted into ragged, fearful sobs. Her eyes fluttered shut as the sedative took hold. The room fell silent again, but the silence was different now. It was heavy, poisoned. The hope that had filled the space just moments before was gone, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. I stood there, trembling, caught between the image of my mother's terror and the ghost of my father's broken heart in the doorway. The fall down the stairs was no longer just a tragic accident. It was now the scene of a crime, and the victim had just named her attacker. But she had pointed at the one person in the world I knew to be innocent. I found my dad in the waiting room, slumped in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs. He was staring at the floor, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, a man hollowed out by a single, impossible sentence. When he looked up at me, his eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a pain so deep it stole my breath. "She thinks I did this to her," he said, his voice a hollow whisper. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. A truth so monstrous he could barely give it voice. I sat down next to him, my own mind reeling. "Dad, no," I said, trying to force a confidence I didn't feel. "She's confused. The doctor said this could happen. It's the coma, the trauma. Her brain is all mixed up." "But why that, Chloe?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Of all the things she could have said, why that?" "My husband tried to kill me." She looked right at me. He shook his head slowly, a gesture of profound disbelief. She looked at me like I was a monster. The image of her screaming face was burned into my mind. The terror had been so genuine, so real. It wasn't the confusion of a waking mind. It felt like a memory, a horrible, visceral memory. The specificity of her words echoed in my head. "My husband." She didn't say David, she said my husband. It was a subtle distinction, but it felt important. Dr. Evans found us there a little while later. He had a grave expression on his face. "She's stable," he began, sitting in the chair opposite us. "We've given her a mild sedative to help with the agitation. Waking from a coma, especially after a significant physical trauma, can be an extremely disorienting experience." "She thinks I pushed her," my dad said bluntly, his voice flat. "She's terrified of me." The doctor nodded slowly. "This is not unheard of," he explained. "It's a form of post-traumatic amnesia, sometimes coupled with confabulation. The brain has suffered an injury. It tries to make sense of the pain and the memory gaps by filling them in. Often it pulls from older, deeply embedded emotional memories. It can misidentify people, conflate past events with the present." He paused, looking at my dad with sympathy. "Does your wife have any history of significant trauma, particularly involving a relationship?" My dad went pale, a sickly, ghostly white. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He glanced at me, a flicker of old pain and secrecy in his eyes, before turning back to the doctor. "Yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Her first husband. His name was Marcus. It was bad. Very bad. It felt like a bomb had gone off in the quiet waiting room. I knew, in a vague, abstract way, that my mother had been married briefly before she met my dad. It was a closed chapter, a book sealed and placed on the highest shelf, never to be opened. My mom never spoke of it. My dad, out of respect for her, never spoke of it. It was simply a fact, like knowing she'd grown up in a different state. Now, that sealed book had just been ripped open. Later, we sat in the hospital cafeteria. The smell of lukewarm soup and disinfectant did nothing to soothe my frayed nerves. My dad stirred a cup of coffee he had no intention of drinking. He looked exhausted, but the brokenness had been replaced by a grim resolve. He had to make me understand. I should have told you about him years ago, he started, his eyes fixed on the swirling liquid in his cup. Your mother wanted to protect you from it. She wanted our life to be a clean slate. No shadows from the past. What happened, Dad? I asked gently. He took a deep breath. His name was Marcus Thorne. She met him in college. He was charming, handsome, the kind of guy who could talk anyone into anything. She thought he was the love of her life. He let out a bitter, humorless laugh. Behind closed doors, he was a different person. Controlling, jealous. He'd check the mileage on her car. He'd go through her purse. He'd get angry if she was a few minutes late coming home from work. I listened, horrified. This was a side of my mother's life I couldn't even imagine. The strong, confident woman I knew had once been trapped in a nightmare. It got worse, my dad continued, his voice low. He started putting her down, telling her she was stupid, that she was lucky he put up with her. Then he started to control the money. He made her quit her job. She became completely dependent on him. Did he ever hit her? I asked, dreading the answer. My dad's jaw tightened. He nodded slowly. Once. She told me it was just once. A slap during an argument. But for her, that was the line. She packed a bag that night while he was asleep and she left. She never went back. The story was awful, but it explained so much. The terror in my mom's eyes wasn't for my dad. It was for Marcus. Her injured brain had seen her husband, David, standing by her bed, and it had pulled up the file for husband. But it had opened the wrong one, the corrupted one, the one labeled danger. The divorce was a nightmare, Dad said. He fought her on everything. He tried to claim she was mentally unstable. He dragged it out for over a year. By the time it was over, she was a wreck. She moved here to start fresh. That's when I met her. He finally looked at me, his eyes pleading for me to understand. She has spent 30 years building a new life, a safe life, forgetting him. The fall, it must have unlocked that old fear. Her brain is just superimposing his face onto mine. I reached across the table and put my hand on his. We'll get through this, Dad, I said, my voice firmer now. We just have to give her time. We have to help her remember who you are. He squeezed my hand, a flicker of his old strength returning to his eyes. But the road ahead felt long and treacherous. My mom was awake, but in a way, we had still lost her. She was trapped in a prison of her own memory, and the man she loved most was now her jailer. The days that followed were a delicate, painful dance. My mother's condition was a roller coaster of lucidity and terror. She would have moments of clarity where she'd ask about her garden or complain about the hospital food, sounding exactly like her old self. In those moments, my heart would soar with hope. But they were fragile, easily shattered. The sight of a male doctor who vaguely resembled my dad in build, or a loud noise in the hallway, could send her spiraling back into a state of panic, muttering about him and how he was coming for her. My dad was barred from her room. His presence was the primary trigger for her episodes. He took to sitting in the waiting room for hours on end, just to be close to her. He'd text me every hour. How is she? Did she eat anything? Did she say anything? Each message was a small testament to his unwavering love and his profound agony. It was killing him to be kept away, to be seen as the source of her pain. I became the bridge between them. I spent my days at her bedside, a buffer against the world and her own fractured mind. I would read to her, talk to her about my work, about funny things our dog did, about anything and everything that belonged to our safe, happy world. I avoided any mention of my dad or the fall. During her clearer moments, she would talk, her memories emerging in disjointed fragments. She never named Marcus, but she spoke of him constantly. "He was always so angry about money," she said one afternoon, staring at the television without seeing it. "He told me I was useless with it, that I couldn't be trusted." I thought of my dad, who had always encouraged my mom's little splurges on her garden, who called her antique hunting investing in happiness. The man she was describing was a stranger. "He sounds awful, Mom," I said softly. "He was," she whispered, a tear rolling down her temple and into her hair. "He said I was worthless, that no one else would ever want me." These were not just snippets of a bad marriage. They were the building blocks of psychological abuse, stones that had been used to wall her in. I felt a surge of cold anger toward this man, this ghost from the past who was still managing to hurt her after all these years. One evening, as I was getting ready to leave, she grabbed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Her eyes were wide and lucid, but filled with a chilling fear. "Chloe," she whispered, her voice urgent, "you have to believe me. He said he would do it." "Do what, Mom?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "He said he'd make it look like an accident," she said, her voice dropping lower, as if she was afraid of being overheard. "He told me he would wait. He'd wait until I was happy, until everyone thought I was finally safe. And then he'd come back and finish it." A cold dread washed over me. This wasn't a vague, confused memory of a past argument. It was a specific threat, a promise. The words, "make it look like an accident," echoed in my head, overlaying themselves onto the image of my mother at the bottom of the stairs. The police had been quick to close the case. A middle-aged woman, a misstep on a familiar staircase. It was a tragically common household accident. But what if it wasn't? The thought was so terrifying I tried to push it away. It had to be the trauma talking, her brain weaving a narrative to explain the inexplicable pain. But the seed of doubt had been planted. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of my dad's devastated face warred with the chilling certainty in my mom's voice. I needed to talk to someone who knew the whole story, someone who wasn't my heartbroken father. I needed an outside perspective. At 2 a.m, I found myself scrolling through my contacts until I found the number from my Aunt Carol, my mom's younger sister. I hesitated. It was late, and this was a topic our family had collectively buried. But my mother's words had changed the stakes. I pressed the call button. She answered on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep. "Chloe, is everything okay? Is it your mom?" "She's okay. She's awake," I said quickly. "But something's happened. She's confused. Aunt Carol, I need to ask you about Marcus." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her take a deep breath. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice suddenly wide awake and full of a weary sadness. "Your mother made us all promise never to speak his name again. She wanted him erased." "I know," I pleaded. "But she's having these memories. She's terrified. She thinks Dad is him. She thinks he tried to hurt her." I repeated what my mom had said about him wanting to make it look like an accident. Carol let out a sharp, pained sigh. "That sounds like him," she said, her voice hardening. "That's exactly the kind of twisted thing he would say. He was a monster, Chloe. A charismatic, smiling monster. The abuse was severe. It wasn't just emotional. He controlled every aspect of her life. When she finally left him, he stalked her for months. He would call her work. He would send her these awful, threatening letters. He told her that if he couldn't have her, no one would." My blood ran cold. This was so much worse than my dad had let on. Why did no one do anything? I asked, a note of anger in my voice. We tried, Carol said defensively. But Ellie was so ashamed. She didn't want anyone to know how bad it was. And Marcus was clever. He made everyone else think she was the unstable one. By the time she got the restraining order, she was already planning to move away and start over. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was hesitant, laced with a new kind of worry. Chloe, there's something else. Something I didn't tell anyone. What is it? I asked, my sense of dread deepening. I saw him, she said quietly. About 2 months ago, I was at the mall in Fairview, and I saw him walking out of a department store. I'm sure it was him. He's older, of course, but you don't forget a face like that. Fairview was only a 30-minute drive from my parents' house. Did you talk to him? No, she said quickly. I hid behind a kiosk until he was gone. I didn't tell your mom. I didn't want to upset her. She's been so happy, so peaceful for so long. I thought it must just be a coincidence, but now... She trailed off, the implication hanging in the air between us. It wasn't a coincidence. A man who had once stalked my mother, who had threatened to finish it when she was happy and safe, had reappeared in her vicinity just a few months before she had a mysterious fall. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture that was more terrifying than I could have imagined. My mother wasn't confusing the past with the present. The past had come back. And it may have tried to kill her. Aunt Carol's words echoed in my head long after the call ended. Marcus was here. He had been seen in a town just a short drive from my parents' home. A man who had haunted my mother's past was no longer a ghost. He was flesh and blood, and he had been nearby. The official story, the one the police and even my dad had accepted, was that my mom had tripped. Maybe she was carrying a laundry basket. Maybe her sock slipped on the polished wood of the top step. It was a simple, tragic, and believable explanation. But now, it felt too simple. It felt like a cover story. I went to the hospital early the next morning with a new, frantic energy. I had to be sure. I had to eliminate the most horrible possibility first. Even if my gut told me it was impossible. I found my dad in the cafeteria, nursing the same cup of coffee as yesterday. He looked up as I approached, his eyes searching mine for any news, any sliver of hope. Dad, I said, sitting down across from him. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Where were you when Mom fell? He looked taken aback, then a fresh wave of hurt washed over his face. Chloe, you don't think... No, I said quickly, reaching for his hand. No, I don't, but the police might ask again. We need to have everything straight. Her accusations, they're making things complicated. He seemed to understand. He sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. It was a Tuesday, around 2 in the afternoon. I went to the grocery store. We were out of milk, and Eleanor wanted those specific tomatoes from the farmer's stand they have out front. I have the receipt in my wallet. I can show you. He started fumbling for his wallet, his hands shaking slightly. I believe you, Dad, I said gently. What else? I called you on my way home, he said, his memory clear on this point. I was stuck in traffic on the bridge and wanted to let you know I was running a bit late. I pulled out my phone and scrolled back through my call log. There it was. Tuesday, 2:43 p.m. A call from Dad. I remembered it. I had been in a meeting and had let it go to voicemail. He'd left a message, something about traffic and tomatoes. It was mundane. It was normal. It was a perfect alibi. I got home around 3. He continued, his voice growing thick with emotion as he relived the moment. I called out for her. The house was quiet. I saw the mail scattered at the bottom of the stairs. And then I saw her. He stopped, unable to go on, the horror of the memory silencing him. His story was solid. The receipt, the phone call, it all checked out. He was frantic when he found her, The 911 operator's recording would prove it? My dad was innocent. My heart ached for the injustice of my mom's fear, but a part of me was also flooded with a cold relief. If my dad didn't do it, and it wasn't a simple accident, then that left only one other possibility: Marcus. That night, I drove to my parents' house. The silence was unnerving. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to whisper of the violence that had happened here. I needed to find something, anything that could tell me more about this man. My dad had mentioned letters. I went up to the attic, a dusty, forgotten space filled with the ghosts of my childhood. In a far corner, under a stack of old photo albums, was a small cedar chest, my mom's memory box. I lifted the lid. The scent of dried lavender and old paper filled the air. Inside were her high school diploma, my first baby shoes, postcards from family vacations. And at the very bottom, tied with a faded ribbon, was a small bundle of letters. The return address on the envelopes was from a town I didn't recognize. The handwriting was an aggressive, slanted script. I untied the ribbon. The letters were terrifying. They weren't love letters. They were documents of obsession. "You think you can just leave me, Eleanor? You belong to me," one of them read. Another said, "I see you. I see the way that pathetic little accountant looks at you. Do you think he can protect you from me?" He was talking about my dad. My parents had been dating when he wrote this, but the worst was the last one, written on a piece of paper torn from a legal pad. "You can run and hide behind your new life and your new man, but I'll never let you go. One day, when you least expect it, I'll be back. You'll never be truly free of me." It was a blueprint for what was happening right now. He had been waiting. The thought made me feel sick. This wasn't just about a past trauma resurfacing. This was an active threat, a promise being fulfilled. My mom's words from the hospital came back to me. "He was always so angry about money." My dad had said Marcus tried to control her finances. Was it possible he was doing it again? With my father's hesitant permission, I logged into their online banking portal. He had given me the password a week ago in case I needed to pay bills while he was focused on the hospital. I started with their joint checking account. Everything looked normal. Mortgage payments, utility bills, my dad's paycheck deposit. Then I clicked on my mom's personal savings account. It was an account she'd had since before she married my dad, something she called her rainy day fund. And there it was, a pattern. Starting 3 months ago, there was a withdrawal, $200. 2 weeks later, another $200. The pattern continued, every other week, like clockwork. The last withdrawal was for $500, dated the Monday before she fell. In total, nearly $3,000 had been taken out in cash over a few months. My mom was frugal. She wouldn't be making cash withdrawals like this without a reason. My heart was hammering. This had to be connected. The next day, I went to the hospital with a knot of dread in my stomach. I had to ask her about it, but I had to be careful. I didn't want to trigger another episode. I waited until she was calm, watching a game show on the small television. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice light. "I was looking at some of the finances for Dad, and I had a question. Did you happen to lend some money to a friend recently? There were some cash withdrawals from your savings account." Her hand, which had been resting on the blanket, clenched into a fist. The color drained from her face. She turned to me, her eyes wide with a familiar terror. "He made me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He said if I told anyone, he said he would hurt your father." The air left my lungs. It felt like I had been punched in the gut. This was it, the confirmation. "Who, Mom?" I pressed, my own voice a whisper. "Who made you give him the money?" She squeezed her eyes shut, as if saying the name would summon him into the room. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. "Marcus," she breathed. It was Marcus. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. All the fragmented pieces suddenly slammed together into a single, horrifying picture. My mother's fear wasn't a memory from 30 years ago. It was new. It was fresh. Marcus hadn't just been spotted in a nearby town. He had found her. He had reinserted himself into her life, not with letters this time, but in person. He had been threatening her, extorting money from her. He was the he she spoke of in her moments of terror. The fall was not an accident. My dad was not the man she feared. The monster from her past was real, and he had been in our house. The realization was sickening. He had been blackmailing her. He had terrorized her into silence, bleeding her rainy day fund dry while holding the threat of violence against my father over her head. The argument she must have had with him at the top of the stairs that day wasn't a random event. It was the culmination of months of fear and extortion. The final withdrawal, the larger amount of $500, had been the day before she fell. Maybe she had finally refused to give him more. Maybe she had threatened to tell my dad. And he had silenced her. I felt a surge of rage so potent it made me dizzy. This man, this parasite, had preyed on her for years, and just when she thought she was free, he had crawled back out of the woodwork to torment her again. He had pushed her, left her for dead, and in the process, he had framed the one man who had spent 30 years making her feel safe. It was an act of breathtaking cruelty. But rage wouldn't help my mom. I needed proof. Hard proof. My mother's testimony, in her current state, would be dismissed as the ravings of a brain-damaged woman. The bank withdrawals were suspicious, but they were just cash. There was no paper trail leading to him. I needed something undeniable, something that would chain Marcus to this crime. My mind raced back to the attic, to the cedar chest, the letters. They were proof of his past behavior, of his obsessive and threatening nature. I drove back to the house that evening, my purpose clear. I went straight to the attic and retrieved the bundle of letters. I read through them again, more carefully this time, looking for any detail I might have missed. As I was placing one of the letters back into its envelope, my fingers brushed against something stiff inside the fold. I pulled it out. It was a small, grainy photograph, a cheap snapshot from a different era. It showed a much younger man with dark, intense eyes and a confident, almost arrogant smirk. It was Marcus. He was handsome in a predatory way, and looking at his face, I felt a visceral wave of revulsion. I turned the photo over. On the back, in the same slanted, aggressive handwriting as the letters, was a note. "I'll always be watching. You can't escape." And beneath it, a phone number. My heart leaped. It was an old number, probably disconnected for decades. But it was a tangible link, a concrete piece of his past. I took a picture of it with my phone. It was a long shot, but it was more than I had before. I knew I couldn't do this alone. Going to the police now, with a convoluted story about a 30-year-old grudge, a brain-damaged witness, and a disconnected phone number, would get me nowhere. They would pat me on the head and tell me to let them do their jobs. I needed more. I needed someone who could corroborate the history, someone who knew just how dangerous Marcus was. My thoughts turned to Aunt Carol's words on the phone. "We tried," she had said, but Ellie was so ashamed. Then I remembered something else she'd said, something about my mom not being entirely alone when she escaped. I called her back. "Aunt Carol," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "When Mom left Marcus, did she have any help? Was there anyone who knew what was really going on?" "Oh, of course," Carol said immediately. "Her friend Jane Miller, they were inseparable back then. Jane was the one who drove the getaway car, so to speak. She picked Ellie up in the middle of the night and let her stay in her apartment for a month while Marcus was hunting for her. Jane saw the worst of it. She was the one who went with Ellie to file the police report and get the restraining order. She's a rock. Jane Miller. The name sounded vaguely familiar, as if from a story my mom told me long ago. "Do you know how I can find her?" I asked. "I think your mom still sends her a Christmas card every year. There must be an old address book somewhere." After I hung up, I went to my mom's desk in the small study downstairs. Tucked in a drawer was a worn, leather-bound address book. I flipped through the pages, past the names of cousins and old neighbors, until I found it. M for Miller. Jane Miller. There was an address in a city 3 states away and a phone number. My hand trembled as I dialed. A woman answered, her voice warm and friendly. "Hello? Is this Jane Miller?" I asked. "It is. Who's calling?" "My name is Chloe. I'm Eleanor's daughter." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Eleanor? Oh my goodness. Chloe, I remember when you were born. How is your mother? We haven't spoken in ages, just the yearly cards." My throat felt tight. "She's in the hospital," I said, and I proceeded to tell her everything. The fall, the coma, the awakening, the terrifying accusation against my father, and my own dawning realization about Marcus. I told her about the money, the threats my mom remembered, and the fact that he had been seen in town. Jane listened without interrupting, the silence on her end of the line heavy and attentive. When I finished, her voice was cold, stripped of its earlier warmth. "That bastard," she said, the words a low growl. I knew he was too quiet for too long. I always worried he'd come back. "You believe me?" I asked, a wave of relief washing over me. "Of course I believe you," she said fiercely. "I was there, Chloe. I saw the bruises he tried to explain away. I read the letters he sent. I sat with your mother while she cried for weeks, terrified he was going to find her and kill her. This is exactly his playbook. He wants to destroy her happiness because he can't stand that she built a life without him." Jane's validation was like a shield. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't just a panicked daughter grasping at straws. "The police won't listen to me," I said. "I don't have enough." "Marcus was always slick," Jane said. "He knows how to cover his tracks, but he has a weakness: his ego and his family. They always protected him no matter what he did." She paused. "He had a younger brother, Kevin, a real piece of work. Kevin idolized him and would do anything for him, including lying to the police. I remember Kevin telling me once that Marcus was just passionate and that Ellie was too sensitive. He enabled all of it." "Kevin?" I repeated, the name clicking in my mind. "Do you know where he is?" "Last I heard, he was living somewhere in the next state over, a city called Northwood. He was some kind of sleazy real estate agent. If you can find Kevin, you might be able to find Marcus." As soon as we hung up, I was on my laptop. A quick search for Kevin Thorne Real Estate Northwood brought up a result instantly. A smarmy-looking man in a cheap suit smiled out from a brokerage website. It was him. His page was linked to his social media profile. I clicked on it. His friends list was public. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I scrolled through the names, looking for one in particular. And then I saw it. Marcus Thorne. His profile was private, but his profile picture was visible. It was a family photo. An older, more distinguished-looking Marcus stood with his arm around a smiling woman, 2 teenage children in front of them. He had rebranded himself. He was a respectable family man, a successful businessman, according to the brief bio. I clicked on the About section. He listed his current city of residence. My blood turned to ice. It was Fairview, the same town where Aunt Carol had seen him. His business address for a consulting firm he apparently owned was less than an hour's drive from my parents' house. He wasn't just visiting. He lived there. He had been lurking just over the horizon this whole time, a predator waiting for the right moment. The coincidence was no coincidence. The threat was not a memory. It was here. It was now. And I finally knew his name and where to find him. The knowledge was both terrifying and empowering. Marcus Thorne, the bogeyman from my mother's past, now had a face, an address, and a new life built on a foundation of lies. He had a family who likely had no idea who he really was. He had a reputation to protect. That was his vulnerability. My mother's words echoed in my mind. He said he'd wait until I was happy. He had waited 30 years, and now he had tried to collect on a debt of malice he felt he was owed. I had a motive. The blackmail. I had a suspect. I had a timeline that was becoming clearer. The fall was on a Tuesday afternoon. My dad was at the store between 2 and 3. Marcus lived less than an hour away. It was all plausible. But plausible wasn't enough to put him behind bars. Plausible wouldn't undo the damage he had done to my family. It wouldn't erase the terror from my mother's eyes or the agony from my father's. I needed to force him out of the shadows. I needed to make him make a mistake. My eyes fell on the photo of the old phone number I had taken from the back of the photograph. It was a wild card, a shot in the dark. But men like Marcus, men driven by ego and control, often kept old trophies. Maybe the number was long dead. Or maybe, just maybe, he had kept it. A burner phone, a secret line. It was a desperate idea, but it was all I had. I went to a corner store and bought a cheap prepaid phone. A ghost phone, untraceable back to me. My hands were shaking as I sat in my car in the store's parking lot and punched in the numbers. I didn't want to call. A call could be ignored. A text was more insidious. It would sit there, a silent accusation. I typed out a simple, chilling message. I know what you did to Eleanor. My finger hovered over the send button. This was the point of no return. Once I sent this, I was declaring war. I took a deep breath and pressed send. The silence that followed was deafening. 1 minute passed, then 2. My heart sank. It was a dead number. A stupid, desperate hope. I was about to toss the phone onto the passenger seat when it vibrated, the screen lighting up with an incoming call from an unknown number. It was him. He had taken the bait. I answered, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I held my breath, waiting. Who is this? A voice said. It was smooth, controlled, with an edge of cold authority. It was the voice of a man used to being in charge, the voice of a predator. I said nothing. I let the silence stretch, letting him stew in his own paranoia. I asked you a question, he said again, a flicker of irritation in his tone. If this is some kind of prank, it's not funny. I took a steadying breath. I had to choose my words carefully. I couldn't reveal who I was, but I had to rattle his cage. She's awake, I said, my voice low and steady. And she's talking. There was a sharp, almost inaudible intake of breath on his end. I had hit a nerve. For a split second, the mask of control had slipped. I didn't wait for a response. I ended the call and immediately turned off the phone, pulling out the battery for good measure. Let him wonder. Let him panic. Let the fear that he had inflicted on my mother for so long begin to eat away at him. The next step was to bring my dad into the loop. I couldn't protect him from this anymore. He needed to know the truth, the whole ugly story. I found him in the hospital garden, a small, sad patch of green where he went to escape the sterile confines of the waiting room. I told him everything. I told him about Marcus being in Fairview, about the blackmail, the bank withdrawals, the letters, the phone call I had just made. As I spoke, I watched the grief on his face slowly morph into something else. The deep, passive hurt was being burned away by a new, cold anger. The image of his wife, my mother, being terrorized and extorted under his own roof, while he remained oblivious, was a violation he couldn't bear. That son of a bitch, he said, his voice a low growl. He stood up, his posture straight for the first time in weeks. The slumped, defeated man was gone, replaced by a husband and father ready to fight. He did this. He hurt her and he made her afraid of me. His hands clenched into fists. What do we do? We go to the police, I said. Together. This time we don't just have my mom's confused words. We have a motive. We have a history of abuse. We have a suspect who lives nearby and who has just been made aware that we're on to him. We can create a formal record. We went to the police station that afternoon. We asked to speak with a detective. We were shown into a small, bleak interview room where we met a man named Detective Miller. He was in his late 40s with a tired face and eyes that seemed to have seen it all. He listened patiently as we laid out the entire story, from the 30-year-old divorce to the text message I had sent an hour ago. I could see the skepticism in his eyes. It was a convoluted tale, full of old wounds and circumstantial evidence. So, you're saying her ex-husband, a man she hasn't seen in 3 decades, suddenly reappears, blackmails her, and then pushes her down the stairs? He summarized, his tone flat. Yes, my dad said, his voice firm. That's exactly what we're saying. And her brain is so traumatized that she's mixing me up with him. And you have no proof he was there? No proof of this blackmail? Miller asked. She told me, I said. And there are the cash withdrawals, and the threatening letters from 30 years ago. Miller sighed. Look, I sympathize with your situation, but a brain-damaged victim's statement, old letters, and some ATM withdrawals aren't enough for me to bring this man in. He'll deny everything. He'll say your mother is unstable, just like he did during the divorce. We need something that puts him at the scene. My heart sank. He was right. We were still missing the critical piece. What about his alibi? I pressed. For the day she fell, can you at least check that? Miller considered this for a moment. It was a standard routine piece of police work. It was the least he could do. Fine, he said, jotting down Marcus's name and the business address I had found. I'll have a uniform go and ask him some questions, see what he says, but don't get your hopes up. We left the station feeling dejected. We had fired our shot, but it felt like it had fallen short. The next day passed in a haze of anxiety. Every time my phone rang, I jumped. My dad paced the waiting room like a caged animal. We didn't know if Marcus would panic and run, or if he would lawyer up and build a wall of denial around himself. Late the following afternoon, my phone finally rang. It was Detective Miller. I think you and your father should come down to the station, he said, his voice devoid of its earlier skepticism. We've had a development. When we arrived, Miller led us back to the same interview room. We paid a visit to Mr. Thorne, he began. He was just as slick as you predicted. Calm, collected. He said he hadn't seen or spoken to Eleanor in 30 years. He expressed deep sorrow for her accident. He's lying, my dad spat. I know, Miller said, a grim smile touching his lips. Because while he was talking, we were running his plates. His car was flagged by a license plate reader at an intersection 3 blocks from your parents' house on the day of the fall. 20 minutes before the 911 call was made? I gasped. My dad grabbed my arm, his grip tight. You got him, he whispered. Not yet, Miller cautioned. It puts him in the area, which contradicts his statement, but it doesn't put him in the house. So we brought him in for a more formal conversation. He kept denying it. He had an alibi for the time of the fall. He said he was in a meeting at his office. We checked. His business partner confirmed it. The meeting was from 1 to 3. My hope plummeted. But the fall was around 2:30, I said. Exactly, Miller said. But I had a feeling he was lying, so I pressed his partner. The partner finally admitted the meeting ended early, around 1:45. But he also said Marcus didn't leave the office until after 3. He claimed Marcus was on a long, private phone call. Miller leaned forward. There's a 45-minute gap in his alibi, from roughly 1:45 to 2:30. Not quite enough time to drive to your house, have a confrontation, and get back to his office to make it look like he never left. It's close, but his lawyer would tear it apart. It felt like we were so close, yet still so far. So what now? I asked, my voice flat with disappointment. So, Miller said, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. I decided to take a drive. I canvassed every business with a security camera between his office and your house. It took a while, but I found it. A gas station about 5 minutes from your street. The timestamp on the footage is 2:17 p.m., and the camera caught a clear shot of his car pulling in and him getting out to buy a bottle of water. He had him. He had absolutely, unequivocally destroyed Marcus's alibi. He was there. Miller told us they had just confronted Marcus with the security footage. The mask had shattered. He broke down. But he didn't confess to attempted murder. He spun a new story, a self-serving tale of a tragic misunderstanding. He admitted to the blackmail. He said he was in financial trouble and had reached out to Eleanor, appealing to their shared history. He claimed she had agreed to help him. He said he went to the house that day to pick up the last payment. Miller recounted, his voice laced with disgust. He says they argued at the top of the stairs because she had changed her mind. He claims she got worked up, backed away from him too quickly, lost her footing, and fell. He says he panicked and ran. He's trying to paint it as an accident. At best, involuntary manslaughter. At worst, criminally negligent homicide. He's trying to save his own skin. I felt a fresh wave of fury. He was still lying, still minimizing his cruelty. He hadn't just watched her fall. He hadn't just panicked. There was a malice in him that went deeper than that. I knew it. And then, a memory surfaced. A small, whispered detail from one of my mom's more lucid moments in the hospital, something that had seemed insignificant at the time. He took my locket, she had whispered one night, her hand fluttering to her neck. David gave it to me. He took it. The locket. It was a simple gold heart my dad had given her for their first anniversary. She never, ever took it off. It was a part of her. I remembered noticing the faint red mark on her neck at the hospital, but had dismissed it as a pressure sore from how she had lain after the fall. "Detective?" I said, my voice shaking with sudden insight. My mom's locket. A gold heart necklace. My dad gave it to her. She was wearing it when she fell, I'm sure of it. But it wasn't on her at the hospital. And it's not at the house. I looked. He took it. Miller's eyes narrowed. He stared at me for a long moment, processing the implication. Panicked men run. They don't stop to steal jewelry from the body of the woman they just accidentally killed. Thieves steal. Predators take trophies. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I'm positive," I said. "She told me he took it." Miller stood up abruptly. "Wait here," he said, and walked out of the room. The wait was agonizing. My dad and I sat in silence, the air thick with anticipation. Every minute felt like an hour. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Detective Miller returned. He was holding a small, clear plastic evidence bag. Inside it was a familiar glint of gold. My mom's locket. The chain was broken. "We got a warrant to search his car while he was being questioned," Miller said, his voice grim. "We found this tucked under the passenger seat. He tried to hide it." He placed the bag on the table in front of us. "His fingerprints are all over the clasp. The chain is snapped. It was ripped from her neck." This was it. The final damning piece of evidence. This wasn't the action of a man who panicked after an accident. This was an act of violence, of dominance. He had argued with her. He had likely pushed her. And as she fell, as she was at her most vulnerable, he had reached out and ripped her most cherished possession from her neck. It was a final act of violation, a symbol of his ultimate victory over her. He had taken the one thing that represented her happy life with my father. "The charge is no longer manslaughter," Miller said, his voice cold and hard. "We're charging him with attempted murder, and robbery, and extortion." I looked at the locket in the bag, the broken chain a testament to his brutality. He hadn't just tried to kill her. He had tried to erase her happiness, to steal the very symbol of her life without him. But he had failed. He had overplayed his hand. His arrogance, his cruelty, his need to take a trophy. It was going to be his downfall. The monster was finally caught. The downfall of Marcus Thorne was swift and total. The news of his arrest spread like wildfire. His carefully constructed life, his respectable facade, crumbled into dust overnight. The charges were serious. Attempted murder, robbery, and multiple counts of extortion. With the combined evidence of the gas station footage, his shattered alibi, and the stolen locket with his fingerprints on it, the district attorney had a case so solid that bail was denied. Marcus, the man who had exuded control and arrogance, was now sitting in a county jail cell, stripped of his tailored suits and his power. His new wife, the smiling woman from his social media photo, was blindsided. She had apparently known nothing of his past, nothing of the monster lurking beneath the surface of the charming businessman she had married. When the details of the case became public, the 30-year grudge, the systematic blackmail, the brutal attack, she was horrified. She packed up their children and left him without a second thought, filing for divorce before the preliminary hearing even took place. His business partners, equally shocked and worried about the scandal tainting their firm, immediately dissolved their partnership and issued a public statement disavowing him. In the space of a week, Marcus lost his family, his career, and his freedom. He had tried to destroy my mother's life, and in doing so, had utterly annihilated his own. While his world was imploding, my family's world was slowly, carefully, beginning to heal. The most significant change was in my mother. With the knowledge that Marcus was caught and could no longer hurt her, a profound shift occurred. The constant, simmering terror that had kept her mind in a fog began to recede. The fractured memories started to knit themselves back together in the correct order. The confusion in her eyes was gradually replaced by a weary recognition. The true turning point came about a week after Marcus's arrest. I was sitting with my mom, reading a magazine aloud, when my dad appeared in the doorway of her hospital room. He had been hesitant to try again, terrified of causing another panic attack. He stood there, just on the threshold, his heart in his eyes. My mom turned her head. She looked at him. For a long moment, she was silent, her expression unreadable. I held my breath. My dad looked like he was preparing to be struck. And then, her lips curved into a small, weak but genuine smile. "David," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was full of a warmth and love that we hadn't heard since before the fall. "You're here." My dad let out a shaky breath, and tears welled in his eyes. He slowly walked to her bedside and took her hand. "I'm here, Ellie," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm always here." She squeezed his hand. "I know," she said softly. The nightmare was over. The ghost that had haunted her room and her mind was finally gone. She saw her husband again, not the monster from her past. The aftermath rippled out to the other people in our lives. I called Aunt Carol to tell her the news. She cried with relief, but also with guilt. "I should have told her I saw him," she said, her voice choked with regret. "Maybe if I had warned her, this wouldn't have happened." "You can't think like that," I told her firmly. "You were trying to protect her peace. Marcus is the only one to blame for this. No one else." We talked for a long time, and I think, by the end of the call, she had started to forgive herself. I also called Jane Miller, the friend who had been my first true ally in this fight. She was overjoyed. 30 years, she said, her voice triumphant. "It took 30 years, but he's finally going to pay for what he did to her. You did this, Chloe. You saved your mom." Her words filled me with a sense of pride I hadn't allowed myself to feel until then. The only discordant note came from Kevin, Marcus's brother. A few days after the arrest, I received a message request on my social media account. It was from him. The message was short and full of impotent rage. "You and your crazy mother ruined his life," it read. "He never should have gotten involved with her in the first place." I looked at the words, at the pathetic attempt to shift the blame, and I felt nothing but pity. He was an enabler to the very end. I blocked his account without replying and never heard from him again. Months passed. My mother was released from the hospital. Her recovery was long and arduous. She had to learn to walk again, and the fall had left her with a permanent limp and a network of scars. But she was alive, and she was herself. My dad was her shadow, her constant support. He helped her with her physical therapy exercises. He drove her to doctor's appointments. He sat with her in the garden as she slowly regained the strength to tend to her beloved plants. Their love, which Marcus had tried so venomously to tarnish, had become the foundation of her recovery. One crisp autumn evening, I was over at their house for dinner. My mom was moving around the kitchen with a new confidence, still leaning on the counter for support now and then. but determined. My dad was watching her, a look of simple, profound contentment on his face. I was sitting at the kitchen table, watching them, and a sense of peace settled over me. The fear that had been a constant companion for so long was finally gone. The trial was a formality. Faced with the mountain of evidence against him, and with his old support system completely gone, Marcus accepted a plea bargain. He pled guilty to attempted murder and the other charges, avoiding a public trial in exchange for a slightly reduced sentence. He was sentenced to 20 years in a state prison. He would be an old man by the time he got out, if he ever did. I thought about him sometimes, this man who had cast such a long and dark shadow over our lives. He had been driven by a twisted need to prove that my mother couldn't be happy without him. He had set out to take everything from her: her money, her safety, her peace of mind, her life, and even the reputation of the man she loved. But in the end, all he had managed to do was expose his own pathetic cruelty. He had lost everything, while we had found a new appreciation for what we had. My mom came over to the table and sat down beside me. She put her hand on mine. "Thank you, Chloe," she said, her eyes clear and full of a love that mirrored my dad's. "You fought for us." "I would do it again in a heartbeat," I said, squeezing her hand. She looked across the room at my dad, who smiled at her. The love between them was a tangible thing, a quiet, resilient force that had survived the ultimate test. Marcus had tried to make my mother small, to shrink her world down to the size of his own bitterness. He thought he could break her spirit and break our family. But he had failed. He was the one who was now small, confined to a concrete cell, a forgotten man paying for his own hatred. We were the ones who were free, and we were whole.